Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, Who is Harrison Sawyer, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of numerous novels and nonfiction books.
And not with us tonight is the esteemed Molly Jo Reilly, who is continuing her busy schedule of work. And she put it on Facebook, so I guess it's not hidden information anymore, but she's getting ready to make a pretty substantial move across the country. So she's got a few things on her to-do list. So we're hoping to get her back at some point, but for now, we might not see her over the course of the next couple of casts. So Molly, if you're watching this later, we miss you. We're thinking of you. Enjoy your time away from the podcast. We'll call it a vacation. We've given her a hard-earned vacation.
Yeah, because moving is a vacation. Everyone knows that.
Absolutely.
Packing up a house and moving cross country, and yeah, that's vacation time, baby.
That's what I want to do. That's how I would choose to vacation if I could, except I'd end up in Ireland. But I would really miss my wife. She says she won't come with me. So anyhow, moving on, a reminder to those of you watching on YouTube, if you would click that thumbs up button for us, that helps out quite a bit. Go ahead and leave us a comment, share it with all your wonderful followers. That helps us out a great deal. And don't forget, if you want to listen to us live, we do that every other Tuesday, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And you can follow along with us at Firsts in Fiction. No, I'm just kidding. AaronGansky.com/FirstsInFiction Live is where you can watch us live.
And where is that again?
AaronGansky.com/FirstsInFiction Live. If you just go to AaronGansky.com, there's a little button. Just click the button. It says FIF Live. Click it. Do it now. Well, if you're watching this on YouTube later, then we won't be live. So don't do it now. Do it Tuesday, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Moving on. All right. Whew. How was your week, Pops?
It's been a week. It's been a busy time, and I'm starting to feel tired. I think I'm getting old.
Right?
Yeah. I think that could be it. I don't know. It happens.
I'm the oldest young man I know. So.
I can never figure out who the old guy in my mirror is.
He's been visiting mine too, which is creepy when you think about it. The old man in your mirror is visiting mine. Moving on. We don't have Molly here to laugh at our jokes.
There's a story in that.
There is. Ooh. All right. You want it, or am I going to write it?
Oh, I don't know. So somebody write that.
All right. We'll throw it out to the chat room. There you go. Today, continuing on in our 10 Things segment series. There we go. I'm sorry. It's been a long week, as you said, and it's only Tuesday. In our 10 Things series, we're looking today at 10 mistakes that we have made in our writing. It's hard to admit that we've made mistakes sometimes, but we are going to be very humble and bequeath upon to you the mistakes that we have made in writing, in the hopes that you can avoid said mistakes yourself, or perhaps you'll simply recognize them, that you've been making those mistakes as well.
Well, since I don't make mistakes, I had to make up a few. It's all fiction.
The first mistake is thinking you didn't make a mistake.
That's right.
So it was interesting to take a moment to kind of reflect back and think, what mistakes have I made? What would I do differently? And there were perhaps too many to choose from. It seems like, oh yeah, we did mention some in our last cast. So I tried to avoid some of those that we talked about and focus on some different ones. So the first mistake that I made, or maybe not the first one, but the first one that I'm going to talk about tonight, is writing with a thesaurus. Stephen King talks about this, and he says that you should never do it, never write with a thesaurus. There are several reasons. The first reason is, if you're writing with a thesaurus, what you're trying to do is, I don't want to say it's like cheating, but it's kind of like cheating. You're trying to find words that you're not familiar with and trying to use those to make yourself sound smart. At least that's what I was doing. There's no problem in using a thesaurus to come up with a different word to avoid redundancy. But if you're simply just trying to find the biggest, fanciest word that you can to throw into your text so that people will say, ooh, this man is very intelligent, you're in the wrong game. The goal is not to necessarily impress the reader with how expansive your vocabulary is. It's actually quite the opposite. You want to you want the reader to forget that they're reading. You're creating an experience for the reader, or ideally you should be creating an experience for the reader. And that experience is interrupted when you're trying to call attention to how fancy you can be and all the wonderful big words that you know. My first draft of The Bargain really suffered from this, and it took me several drafts to kind of dial it back, and actually have people speak the way real people speak instead of, trying to sound super, super important. And I recently just did a blog. It's not a blogcast. A blog on The Invisible Writer on the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference website. So if you're interested, go ahead and take a quick look at that. But I go into a little bit more detail on that, what I mean about the writer being invisible. And really the goal is to create an environment that the reader can immerse themselves in and forget that they're actually reading. They want to experience. And the only way that you can do that is if you, are a good wizard and you hide behind the curtain to make make the magic happen. You've got to hide behind the curtain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. While you're talking about that, I just flashed on a writer, William F. Buckley Jr. You familiar with him?
Yeah, he's an actor too, isn't he?
No, he was a conservative pundit. He had a show on PBS called Firing Line, and very well documented feud between him and another writer, in which in one case he said, "I will knock your block off." You wonder if he could really do that, but he got pretty upset with Gore Vidal. That's who it was. It was Gore Vidal. Gore Vidal had a tendency to be able to make lots of people dislike him. But anyway, William F. Buckley Jr. had an enormous vocabulary. I like to think I have a decent vocabulary, an above average vocabulary if I'm feeling good about myself. But anytime I would read anything that he had written, and he did a series of novels, the Blackford, his character is named Blackford Oaks, sort of like a James Bond kind of thing. But I would sit down and I would have a dictionary next to me. Now, this was a long time ago, because to let you know, I had to have a dictionary. Now I just ask my smart speaker, use the name, because she will come to life. But anyway, now I just ask for a definition. Or Siri, you can ask Siri for a definition. But back then you had to look it up in your favorite copy of Webster's. And it became very distracting at times. I mean, I was impressed with the vocabulary, and I loved reading and was thinking about being a writer. So I didn't mind doing that too much, but I can't imagine many readers enjoying it. Vocabulary is so large. And I did get the sense that what you were talking about, that he was writing for himself to show off his intelligence. And he was intelligent. There was no doubt about that. But it sometimes made the writing kind of rough to get through.
And that's really what we're trying to avoid in that regard. So,
yeah, which is not to say you want to be overly simplistic or write down to your reader. That doesn't do any good. I always like to aim just what I imagine the top of their head is. I like to aim just a little over their head, because usually you get the meaning of a term from the context. But if I aim too far, then I lose them. Then I'm just being pretentious. And I'm losing readers all along, and it's kind of a show thing. Not a good thing. So I agree with you. Put the thesaurus away.
That might be a good way of thinking of it. Is the flashy words and stuff you want to avoid? But sometimes, as a poet, I believe there are some really beautiful words out there. If you can work it in there, great. We all have words like that. We all have our pet words. Pop's yours is it's macadam, right? It's a homage.
Macadam is one of them, and gossamer. It's a running joke.
Yeah.
For a few of my friends, they look for the words in the books I write. I usually try to get the word in. Macadam, which is asphalt. Macadam is a guy's name who invented asphalt.
Right.
Driving on a paved road, an asphalt road, you're driving on the macadam. I got that from Dean Koontz. I stole that from him in one of his books. And then gossamer, meaning web-like, flimsy. A nightgown might be gossamer, might be a gossamer material, that kind of thing. So I put those in, and a couple of friends commented on it, and I've been sneaking them in here and there. But that's kind of an inside joke.
Cerulean is one of the ones that I like. And it's a beautiful word, beautiful color. So there we go.
The blue, yeah, I've used that one.
Yeah.
Cerulean Sky.
Yeah, and if you are my Hand of Adonai readers will recognize it as the Cerulean Forest, or the Cerulean Woods, right. I think, in the Hand of Adonai series. So, and the monks of the Cerulean Order, that got a lot of play. That word got a lot of play in that particular series. But so I can't be the only one who made a mistake, though, right, Pops? You've made at least one, right?
Oh, yeah, and I tend to compound my mistakes. As I get to thinking about this, I have to go back to what I consider my biggest mistake ever. And this is when I wanted to be a writer, but I was as dumb as a brick. And I've told this story. I probably told it on this podcast a time or two over the years. But I tell it in writers' conferences and the like. I had done my best to write a book. I did. I was in a competition with a friend to see who could get published first. And I was the first one to publish articles. He was the first one to get a book contract. But I had written a novel before he did. But I didn't know anything. I knew zilch, and that's the first mistake. I didn't bother to learn what you needed to know. And it's a common mistake I find among writers. They don't ask, what do I need to know? What do I need to do? What is expected of a writer? What does a book look like? What are the pitfalls? What's the standard formatting? That kind of thing. I was so innocent in Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad here. I was an innocent abroad in this. I didn't even think to put page numbers on. So I made that kind of a mistake, but I really just made mistake after mistake in this thing. The biggest mistake, I think, is I sent it to a pay-to-read agent. And that's just really a no-no. Agents don't charge reading fees. There are some that will. If you find someone who does that, you want to be very careful about that. It's usually considered a very bad form, and I think the official literary agency society frowns on it. I think you can join if you do stuff like that. But anyway, it was in the back of a writer's magazine. I saw the ad. I paid. I sent it off, and I got back some, were not really overly negative comments, but I was too sensitive about it. And, and I made some mistakes. So I just put it up. I put it on the shelf, and it sat there for 5 years. 5 years it was there, doing absolutely nothing. I didn't write another thing. I don't think, literary wise anyway. I didn't write any kind of literature after that for 5 years. Now I blame you because, you were very young then, and, your sisters, they were young. So I usually blame the kids, not having much time.
100% my fault. 100%.
Yeah. That's what I'm going with. But then a friend called, and it was the guy I was competing with, Jack Kavanaugh. And he's written 30, 40 books. I don't remember now. But he got his first book contract, which turned into a 3-book contract, which turned into a 6-book contract, which turned into, 12, 16 books, something like that. But anyway, he called to tell me he had just signed a contract. He just got one. And I think it was at that time for 3 novels. Oddly enough, he had never written a novel. He sold them without writing them. He had enough sample pages. And so I was rejoicing with him on the phone. And he was in San Diego, and I was in the high desert, and was rejoicing with him on the phone. And then he stopped and he said, "So what are you working on?" And then I started this whole litany of excuses. Well, I'm not working on anything right now, because I'm up here now and I'm a pastor, so I'm having to deal with this new church. And he goes, "I understand. I was a pastor. What are you working on?" This goes on for quite a while. I gave every excuse possible. I blamed you and your sisters, and he goes, yeah, I got 3 kids too. So what are you working on? And on it went. So finally I knew I was not getting off the phone. And so I agreed to pull it off the shelf, take a look at it, if he would show it to his editor. There's no guarantee with that. He can commit to doing that, but the editor didn't have to look at it, didn't have to do anything with it. So I went back and I rewrote it, after Jack Kavanaugh had firmly placed his size 12 boot on my fanny. Mm-hmm. And riddled by guilt, I went ahead and rewrote it, sent it off. He did show it to his editor, and that publisher bought it. And that's the book By My Hands, my first book.
It's a pretty good book, by the way.
Yeah, it turned out, but I just didn't know the little things, and that was really my mistake. I did not learn the very basic stuff, and that's the first thing I think any writer needs to do is study what other people are writing, but also go to a writer's conference, get a how-to book, whatever it is. If you can get a good how-to book, how do you do this? What's it supposed to look like? And I could have skipped that whole thing. So I wasted 5 years, half a decade gone. And I think that's why I started writing so much after that. I think it was guilt-driven. And that's why I ended up doing so many books in such a short period of time. Well, it's 20 years, but it still was a lot of books. And I think that's what it was. I was compensating for that big mistake. So what I learned out of that is that there's more to writing than putting words on the page. You have to learn to do that and do it right, but there are other things you have to learn. Some of the basics of the business. You don't have to be an expert in it, but you can get advice. Hopefully you can get an agent. I sold without an agent, but a good agent, that's what I was trying to do. But a good agent would take it aside and say, look, okay, I like the material, but here's what I want you to do. All right, I want the sequential numbers from page 1 all the way through. Don't start the numbering at each chapter. It was a mistake I made. Several other things I had done wrong with that. These are the things I want you to fix up. And that's really one of the things an agent will do. They won't fix them. They'll just tell you, here's what you need to do, and get on that and then get it back to me. So that was my mistake. And waiting so long, granted, there was plenty of other things on my plate. But I still look back now over the decades thinking I flushed 5 years of writing. And who knows what I could have learned during that time or what might have happened. Now, fortunately, it worked out. I did a lot of books. And in the end, no complaints. But I really wish I didn't have that on my personal resume, the one I only show to myself, that right. I made that monstrous mistake. And I'm very thankful for Jack Kavanaugh for, grabbing me by the collar and pulling me out of the mire, putting my feet back on solid ground. And then in a very kind way, forcing me to go back to the book simply by not hanging up and asking the same question over and over again. What are you working on? What are you working on? What are you working on? And one of the things that got me going was at some point he's going to ask me that again. And I'd better be able to tell him I'm working on something. And so that's how that happened. That's really, I think, my biggest mistake. I've got plenty of other mistakes, but that's the one that bugs me the most.
Right. We all have a lot to thank Jack Kavanaugh for getting you going, and the career that you took, the career path that you took, and being the director of the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference. And that phone call that Jack Kavanaugh made had lasting repercussions. I mean, rippled out to, even we're sitting here today. I can thank him for my career, because my career is due largely because of the influence that you had in my life, which is due largely for the influence that he had on yours. So, layers upon layers.
Yeah. And it's one reason I got involved in writers' conferences when I'd finally written enough books where I'd be invited to do that, to teach at it. You don't go in it for the money. Mm-hmm. You make a few $100 if you show up, if you're at one of the big ones. But I wanted to keep other people from making the mistakes that I made. Well, yeah, I'm not so proud that I can't talk about my mistakes. So if I could teach some other people, and that's been one of the real blessings in my life, is especially through writers' conferences, I've sat down with people who are ready to quit because they haven't been able to place their books. And they just ask me, as a last ditch effort, will you look at this? And I'll take a look at it and I'll go, no, you got the chops. Here's what we need to do. And then they've gone on and sold books, had books printed, sold them to publishers. And I have a decent list on that, not because I'm the great counselor. It's just because I wounded myself. I shot myself in the foot. And I want to make sure these other people don't do that.
Right. So good stuff there. Another mistake.
Also why I do this with you, because, I'm not, on the pittance you pay me. So.
Oh, no, the check's in the mail, Pops.
That's been for 2.5 years.
No, I mailed it like in 2012. I remember very distinctly it got in the mail.
Just be patient, Pops. Be patient.
Call the post office. It's on them right now. it wouldn't clear anyway. Whatever check I wrote to you, $6 probably wouldn't clear. So another mistake that I make, and I noticed this in a lot of beginning writers, is that we tend to write about people like us, or we write about ourselves, or our idealized version of ourselves, right? My first novel was, of course, about a writer, because this is going to shock you, but I wanted to be a writer, famous writer. And so my protagonist, of course, was a famous writer, and all this kind of stuff that, acted like me, spoke like me, loved all the things that I loved, hated all the things that I hated. There's nothing wrong with having a character have some of your personality traits. I think it's impossible for us to completely 100% separate us from our characters. It's fine if characters take on certain aspects of your personality, but they shouldn't be doppelgangers. They shouldn't be facsimiles. The reason is it kind of shortchanges what they could be if you let them be who they should be. I know that sounds crazy, but I tend to think more and more that I create characters less than I discover characters. These are real, living, breathing human beings that are not necessarily like me in every way. We might like each other. We might hang out together if they were real, but they're not going to speak the way I speak. They're not going to think the way I think. Some of these characters can even challenge some of my deeply held beliefs. And I think that's really where you want to be, because once you're at a point where you can conceive of a character that is very different than you, then you can think of other characters that are different than you. Then all of your characters become deep and rich and complex. And instead of these kind of shallow two-dimensional facsimiles of each other where they all want the same thing, you'll be able to get a lot more conflict that way. And so don't shortchange your characters by making them copies of yourself.
Yeah, a good point. There's a lot of ego that goes into writing. And I think there are two types of writers in the world. There are two types of people in the world, those who divide the world into two types and those who don't. But sometimes I think there's two types of writers, and those who write because they're either insecure or they want to be famous, and that's really what they're after. They want to see their name on a book cover. And believe it or not, that's what one of the things that motivated Tom Clancy. He said he just wanted to see his name on a book cover. Well, that turned into quite a career, so it worked out for him. But then there are those that love the art. And those are the ones that usually have a lasting career. So yeah, some good stuff there. I think one of my next mistakes. Oh, I'm sorry, you had something there?
Oh, I was just going to say that there are really two types of people in the world: those who can count.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a long way to go for a really bad joke.
I was thinking you should have listed three things. There are two types of people, and then list three types of people.
Yeah.
All right. So here's another one of mine. Since we've opened the closet and showing our skeletons here, and that was taking too long to develop the courage to question myself about my knowledge, my technique, and my skills. And only after I learned that there is always a way to get better, do better, and be better did I really become a writer, I think. Now, that's all of this is a process of becoming. Few of us ever start off with all this knowledge in our head and all this wisdom. Sometimes we get it by getting our bumps and our bruises with that. And being a writer is an emotional thing. There's emotional highs and there's emotional lows. And trying to get all of that balanced. So, for example, I went through one portion of my life where I just didn't think I could write very well. And one of the reasons was I was reading Dean Koontz, who I think is a master craftsman. I don't always like the story he tells. I like many of them, but I don't always like all of the stories that he tells. But I do like the way he tells them and the way he handles the language and how he does description and how he does dialogue and all of that. And so I got depressed and I started saying, I can't write like him. I'll never be that good. I don't know who I'm fooling here. So I went through this kind of low period. And in doing that. And then I had this flash of brilliance. And the flash of brilliance was I went down to a bookstore. You might remember the bookstores where you'd go and buy a book in person. Now there's, I think Barnes and Noble are one of the last ones still doing that. But I went down and I went to the long, very long shelf of Dean Koontz books. And I started going through them one by one, looking at the copyright page. And I bought 3 of his earliest books. He wrote on a bunch of different names. I think he wrote under 12 different pseudonyms because he was trying every genre possible, trying to make it, trying to break in. And I found the 3 of his earliest books that I get my hands on. I went home and read them. Oh, and they were horrible. They were horrible. And I went, yes, this stuff is learned. You're not born with it. It's learned. He had to learn to become a great writer. And that was one of the most encouraging things that ever happened to me. So that's when I began to question myself. What do I need to know? What am I doing wrong? Where are my weaknesses? What are my strengths? I want to capitalize on my strengths. I want to bolster up my weaknesses so that they become strengths. I want to learn all that new stuff. That took me a while to get to. It's a hard thing to say, you really don't have it yet. I've got to work on this and I've got to work on that. But once you do, then your work is so much better that you're bound to be able to sell your work. So it's only after I learned that kind of stuff that I thought I was then an author that was becoming a true author. That at least I understand the principles. I'm not talking about being world famous. I'm talking about putting out a good product, a good story.
Yeah, well said. So bookstores were like libraries?
They were amazing. You could go in and you could pay money and take the book with you. You could take several books with you. You just had to pay for them. That's all. They had people that worked there that were experts in books. Wow. They knew where everything was. It was an amazing thing. But sadly, most of those are gone.
I like the way they smell. Is that weird? Libraries and bookstores.
I'm thinking about our friend Jim. Jim Harris. I went to a bookstore with him a long time ago, and he walked out like 6, 7 books. He goes, "Oh, I like this one." And he'd go through the science fiction section, the fantasy section, these other things. And he'd walk out with 6 or 7 books. And then I'd find out he'd have them done by the end of the week.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that annoyed me a lot.
Wow. Well, you can read faster when you're not really deeply analyzing. And so, the normal reader, we've talked about this before, as writers, we read more slowly than your average reader because we're pulling things apart as we do.
Right.
It doesn't take me long to look at an engine because I look at it and go, yep, don't know how it works. And then I call someone. But the mechanic looks at the engine a lot longer because they know what's going on. So, well said, Pops. Well said. So another mistake that I've made is borrowing too heavily from established settings and characters and turns of phrases. Really, it was just everything was cliche. My first novel was a cliche setup. It was, this demon-possessed serial killer, and it was like any other demon-possessed serial killer novel that you've ever read, complete with the, stock, good cop, bad cop team, all this kind of nonsense. It just, none of it felt real because it all felt so, well, nothing was original. And so, this is kind of a hallmark of new writers. I think of it like when you first learn to play guitar, you're not writing your own music. When you first learn to play guitar, you're learning how to play, Stairway to Heaven or Nirvana or whatever it is that you want to play, Eric Clapton. You learn how to play what you love. As a matter of fact, I'll tell a quick story. When I was in the band, way back in the day, the first band I was in, one of the first bands I was in, and they were very excited because they got this new guitar player and he can play like Eddie Van Halen. He's that good. I said, all right. So this kid shows up and he starts playing like this Eddie Van Halen lead. Just, it was really impressive. And I was like, okay, well, let's play this song. It's just an E chord and a C chord. And he goes, wait, what's an E chord? And I was like, okay. That was all he could do. He had that one solo. But
I'm going to add to that because that's not always a disqualifier. B.B. King, who's a great guitarist, but he was a blues guitarist. and he was playing with a famous rock band. They asked him to sit in, and they were telling him what they were going to come in on this A minor augmented or something like that, and he had no idea. He said, "No, I don't play like that. This is how I play." And he started playing his guitar, which he had named Lucille. He started playing his guitar, and they go, "Okay, let's go with that."
Yeah. Yeah, we're not all BB King though.
That's very few are.
Yeah. But it was again, it was just me trying out some cover songs. And that's fine. It's fine if that's how you learn to write, you know, singing somebody else's song, but eventually we have to move away from that. And you can improvise on it. And that's what, in that to keep that musical metaphor and analogy going, BB King may not have known the technical term for something, but he understood the workings of it. If he heard a chord, he could understand the notes that went along with it, that fit it, and he could improvise. And so he was playing at a very high level in that regard, even though he may not have had the technical expertise, if you will, that these other ones had. But he established his own voice, and he moved away from all the cliche kind of well-trod type songs, if that makes sense. So,
okay, my next one was falling in love with the trappings instead of the work, which happens to a lot of writers. I thought, you know, you write a book and you're going to be wealthy. Ain't necessarily so. It does happen. I've heard of people writing one book in their life and getting 7-figure advance. Doesn't happen often. And by the way, you never hear from the writer again. But rarely does that happen. And I was falling in love with the trappings instead of the work. I wanted to be called an author. I wanted to, you know, people hear my name and go, "Hey, you know, there's an author with your name," that sort of thing. All this youthful arrogance that I had. And, you know, embarrassed to even talk about it now, but, you know, it might be helpful to somebody. And those are the things I was thinking about more than writing the book. But I always did have a love for the art form. I always loved the reading. So that did keep me grounded somewhat. But then there came a point where I realized that what I really loved was the work, was creating something out of nothing, something that could maybe bring a little message. Didn't necessarily have to have a global message, but to see people without courage become brave, those sorts of things, explore, edify, do all of those kinds of things. I began to really love doing the work, and that became more important to me. Doing the best I could doesn't mean I always did the best possible. I have a couple of books that, you know, I don't know. You can't hit a home run at every at bat, but anyway, but I had come to love the work. Only then could I produce good work, not just passable work. Only then could I really produce good work. You know, stay away from formula, be character rich, have something that matters in this story. And then in the process, when you do away with formula, you have to become an explorer. And that's what part of your writing is this explorative writing. Sometimes, you know, it's called intuitive writing and other kinds of things, discovery writing. You don't necessarily know where you're going. You have now the skills to make it happen, but you're always exploring a little bit and willing to change what you think is going to happen to something else because it's better. You now recognize that. So the only way I found that I could produce good work is to love the work more than I loved myself.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. I think that's the difference between writers who make it, who can sustain a career as a writer, and those who don't. It's the ones who love the work. If you go into it and you just want to see your name on a book, then you're probably going to stop after you get your one book. I think, and this is not to in any way slight people who self-publish, because there have been some really quality novels out there that have been self-published. But by and large, my experience with writers who self-publish just want to have their name on a book, and once they accomplish that, they're pretty much done. They kind of hang it up, and they like to go around and say, "Oh, I'm a writer. Look, I wrote a book." Okay, that's great. It's not easy work to write a book. It's not easy work to self-publish. I'm not making light of that. But I think real writers continue to do it whether or not they have a guaranteed contract, whether or not they're going to make any money on it. It's just something that's in them. And they do it not for the accolades or the trappings, as you say, but for the love of the art.
Right.
Yeah. So another mistake that I made early on is a lack of world building and specificity. I had it in my head that by not giving specific details, that my work was becoming universal. And I've used this multiple times on this podcast, this lesson that I've learned, but I wrote a short story in college, and my professor asked, where does the story take place? And I said, well, just any small town in America. And he goes, but it's not just any small town in America. You know, a love story in New York is not a love story in LA, is not a love story in Texas, is not a love story in Canada, is not a love story in Alaska, is not a love story in Germany. Like, take your pick. The setting should always have an impact on the work itself. It should play a role in it. And to do that, you have to be specific. I fell into the same trap with characters. I didn't want to describe them in great detail because I wanted this grandma character to feel like grandma to everyone. Well, there's a weird psychology to it that the more you describe a character like a grandmother, it doesn't matter how contradictory those details are to what your idealized version of a grandma should be. You are still going to kind of conceptualize your ideal grandma, if that makes sense. You will tell the reader that this grandma has white hair, but the reader thinks, I like blue-haired grandmas. And so in their mind, it's a blue-haired grandma. But if you don't say anything about the hair, they don't have the material to work with. You haven't given them the clay to mold their own kind of character, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
You know, it does. Sometimes I've done it where I haven't detailed a great deal, but always the danger of that is if you don't describe your character, at least to some degree, then the reader will. The reader will make up the image. And then there are times when that can be busted late in the book, then they find out, oh no, this person could never have done that the way I had them imagined. And so you can ruin the reading experience. So I've always thought it's good to give some description, especially if it shows some of their character, and but not over detail. Don't need to know how many freckles are on the face.
I think
it's freckled.
I think of The Pit and the Pendulum, in which Edgar Allan Poe gives us a linguistic breakdown of the blueprints of the room that he's in, the dungeon that he's in, because it's dark, and so his character has to feel, and it's this many steps over here, and this fly in front of this face, and sorry, there's a fly in front of my face. That's perhaps too much detail. We don't need to go quite that far, but just understanding what it feels like in that setting, in that dungeon, is what the important part is. There you go.
All righty, so back to me then, huh?
Back to you.
We're just moving right along here then.
Indeed.
This one is common for others too. Isn't it nice to know we make all the common mistakes?
Yeah.
This is why we argue against them and warn people against them, is because, you know, we've fallen on our faces on these. Listening to the drum beat of other people's drummers. You know, you've heard the phrase, you march to the drum beat of your heart, you know, or you march to your own drum beat, I think is the way that it goes. But sometimes what happens is we become dependent on other people, and we listen to their drummers, and we try to march to their drum beat, and it doesn't fit us. And sometimes the advice we get is not very good. There's a lot of people giving advice and are copying the way other writers do things. You know, I've had people say, I want to write like Fitzgerald. And I'd say, well, you know, that worked out okay for him for a bit, but then it went downhill quickly. Maybe you don't want to write like Fitzgerald. Every writer has to find himself, herself, have to find their own style, their own desire, whatever it may be. But if you're trying to be like another writer, you're wanting to be, you know, a Tom Clancy or a Clive Cussler or somebody like that, you want to be them, you will probably have problems with that, because the comparison game is unwinnable. You're not them. Trying to be like them can be very dangerous and may destroy your career. Writing is self-discovery. You find yourself in the process of writing. You find your voice in the process of writing. People ask me, what voice do you have when you write? I don't know. I'll have to write something to find out, because it can vary from book to book. But, listening to someone else's drum beat isn't the way to go. And that's sometimes goes with where we get our advice, which I'll talk about in the next one too. But the idea is you let your story carry you. You let that work carry you. Your next one will be different. Okay, that's the drummer you listen to. You listen to the drum beat of that story, not what someone else is doing. And it took a while for me to learn that I wasn't going to be Dean Koontz. I wasn't going to be Spider Robinson in doing humorous science fiction or even serious science. I wasn't going to be Orson Scott Card. I wouldn't mind writing like Orson Scott Card, because he's just a great writer. But I wasn't going to be Orson Scott Card. I needed to be Alton Gansky. And,
which is difficult. I've been trying to be Alton Gansky for a long time, and it's really a challenge.
You have not been listening to what I've been saying.
Oh.
Did those off there?
Oh, I was chasing the fly.
Yeah.
No, I do hear what you're saying, and I was going for the low-hanging fruit there on the joke, but kind of bringing back that musical analogy of covering somebody else's song. When you're trying to find your voice, sometimes you sing somebody else's song. But what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, or one of the things that I'm inferring from what you say is that there's a high value in reading widely, in reading what other people have written, not to sound like them, not to be like Dean Koontz or Orson Scott Card, but maybe to find the happy medium between them. What notes is Orson Scott Card hitting that you like? What notes are Dean Koontz hitting that you don't like? How can you pull that into your writing? How can you avoid the mistakes that they've made? And listening to a variety of music while you're making music, I think that there's something to be said about reading a variety of texts and voices, especially as you begin writing, to see what's out there, to see what people are doing, to see what's popular, but also to see what's really interesting that maybe is not as popular, but still pretty intriguing, something that's going to get your attention, something that you can run with. You're right, Pops. We are our own writers. We need to be our own writers. But I think that sometimes you can discover that through a little bit of help of the wide reading and wide writing.
I know writers who won't read in the same genre that they're writing in, because they're afraid they'll start lifting stuff. They don't mean to. But it gets in the mind. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish between what you've experienced or what's real, what's organic to you. For example, I am not a great singer, but I can sing in a choir okay, as long as I have people on the sides to me, to one side or the other, that know what they're doing. Okay, so I can match the notes, I can get the tone, I can get the rhythm, all that. If it's just me, it's a train wreck. I just can't do that. So I sometimes have trouble reading the same genre I'm going to be writing in. In fact, I try not to. I can read other stuff. I can read nonfiction. I can do stuff like that, but I don't want to be influenced and accidentally start lifting things, because that can happen. And so I try to shy away from that.
Yeah. I took an opposite approach. Because I started writing in genres that I hadn't written in before. And so I wanted to familiarize myself with the quote unquote canon of the genre. And especially with fantasy, because I'd never done fantasy before. I played fantasy games and really enjoyed them, but a lot of the fantasy stuff that I read, I just didn't enjoy. And so I said, what are the best books? And people told me, and I went out and I bought them and I read them. And some of them I was like, yes, this is it. And the other ones I was like, people read this? But I was able to kind of come up with a plan or a strategy of what I liked in the genre, what I didn't like in the genre, how I was going to honor the genre and pay homage to it, but also how I was going to challenge it in ways that it may not have been challenged before, or maybe just trying to kind of push the envelope a little bit in certain places, to keep things fresh and exciting for readers in that genre, but also to make sure that I'm respecting them enough to deliver a product that they are expecting, that they're going to be satisfied with. But that I was coming from a place of ignorance, that I had not read widely in that particular genre, and so I had to familiarize myself with it. So I will immerse myself in the genre that I'm writing, like up front and before I start writing. But if you're, I think your advice is still sound. If you are perhaps reading too much of one thing, then it's a pretty good bet that you're going to slip into more of a mimicry.
Yeah, that's what you want to avoid, is the mimicry. It's okay to learn from it. That's a good thing to do. And sometimes you can learn some technique that you can immediately apply, but you're not still stealing the content. I have, for new writers who are just trying to break in, they're trying to get a feel for it, wondering what to do. I've encouraged them to sit down with a quality book, a book from a quality writer, sit down at their keyboard and start typing in the material. Do a few pages, you'll start getting the rhythm. You'll start seeing that, but you're not stealing from them. What you're doing is you're learning from them. Mm-hmm. And then, you delete all that, and then you start writing your own stuff.
Wasn't that on Finding Forrester?
I don't recall.
I think he has them do something like that. But yeah, it's to, again, it's warming up and it's singing someone else's song. But just that will help you kind of clear your voice, to sing your own songs. So another mistake that I've made, because we got 12 minutes, so we're still doing okay on time, but is Everybody Loves Raymond. I'm sure you're familiar with the show. I tend to write characters that are often, quote, too good to be true. My editor called me out on it one time, and it's a really interesting exercise. This character is too good to be true, and I thought she was referring to someone else. And I said, "Oh, you mean this character?" And she goes, No, this other one over here. And I thought, oh, I didn't even realize that. He is too good to be true. He's, there's no conflict with this guy. He's easygoing. He's laid back. He's never done anything wrong in his life. He's a stand-up citizen, blah, blah, blah. I'm getting ready to swat a fly. If I just, all of a sudden, my computer just goes flying. I'm losing my mind with this fly buzzing around. If you hear buzzing on my mic, stay off my mic. It's not me. Anyhow, see, now I've lost my place.
Believe it or not, so I did hear the buzzing.
Did you really?
I did. I heard some buzzing, yeah.
Oh,
yeah, it's been flying in front of the camera, so.
Well.
I'm 4 hours away, but I'm squeaking at it too now.
It's only so much you can do, right? What was interesting about that is it forced me to think, okay, this guy must have done something wrong. He must have made a mistake. Maybe it was a big mistake. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't a huge mistake, but he's done something. What has he done? And so we started shooting ideas back and forth. And I said, what about this? And she said, what about that? And I said, what about this? And we kind of found this interesting little backstory that we came up with for this character. I never wrote the scene, but I went back and I rewrote every scene that he was in, and it revolutionized his character. It was just a line here or there about a memory of this or a memory of that, or it gave him a little bit of a sense of guilt for having done something wrong. But knowing what he did and why he did it unlocked that character for me. And so even though it wasn't this radical change in the text, the small, tiny minutia changes that I made had a pretty profound impact. One of the things that I encourage my new writers to do is to come up with the worst thing that the character has ever said. And it doesn't even have to be like illicit language or terrible language. It's just, they've said something that's hurt someone. What was it? And I encourage them to avoid the easy answers of, I wish you were never born, or I hate you, or your face is ugly, or you're a poop head on fire, or I don't know what kids are saying these days. But to try and find something that's a little unusual, but has a pretty profound impact. I started writing some of those scenes out for my characters, and one of them actually made it into, a couple of them actually, two of them made it into my novels, and pretty poignant scenes, both of them. And it really, basically, at that moment, you understand that character. At that moment, you understand them exactly. So characters are often defined not by how good they are, but what mistakes they've made and who they have hurt. I know that there's always a temptation to write about the hero, and it's Luke Skywalker. He's never hurt anybody in his life. And I mean, he cut off his dad's hand, right?
Yeah, but that happens between fathers and
That sons. Reminds me, I need to cut off your hand. He bailed on Yoda before his training was done. But he did it for his friends and these types of things. But some of the present shift and thrust of literature is to have a complex character, a character that's not 100% good. And so you don't have to write a villain. You don't have to write about somebody who, setting houses on fire, but think of something that they've done that they regret, and that can really help to unlock your characters for you.
Yeah, good advice. Yeah. Well, the last one is this. And that is, I had listened to some advice from people who have no idea what they were talking about. And I quickly learned that that's not a good thing to do. I had to learn from the best, and that's a choice that you make. So what I began to do is study my mentors, and all my mentors were in the books on my shelf. Don't have to meet them. You can study what they did and learn from them, and learn what I didn't want to do from them. I don't like the way they handle that. So it doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means it doesn't fit me. But there are a lot of people who will give you advice who have no idea what they're talking about. And you'd be surprised how many people, you might not be surprised, how many people are willing to give opinions about things they have never done. And I've always thought it's like somebody being critical of a doctor who's doing surgery, even though that person's never done surgery. Well, I don't believe he's using the proper technique for that. And so I've read advice about how the format should be on a book, and it's advice from maybe the early 1920s, such as you have to write in Courier font. No, you don't. I've never turned a book in a Courier font. The only thing I know that needs Courier font is screenplays, and that might not even be true anymore. And that's because one page of screenplay is supposed to be 1 minute. Well, that's not true for a book. They're going to change it anyway. Times New Roman, you're good. And that's really all you need. But there are people who are giving advice to writers, even though they have never written a book. They have not done the work. So for me, the people I listen to are those who have done the work, who have suffered through it and stuff. And so my point is just be very careful who you listen to. And in my case, I learned to steal from the best. And then I try to become the best that I could be so people could steal from me. I don't know if they ever do, but that's really one of the goals.
Well said, Pops. Well said. Very good advice. Very good advice. And always challenging yourself to become better. This fly, so help me.
That happened to me one time in one of our podcasts. I could not get rid of the thing.
Your point about listening to advice from the right people is very, very valid. It's hard, I think, for people to find writers who are willing to take a look at their work. And so sometimes that's a challenge. And I understand that. A lot of people do writers groups and writers clubs, which is fine.
Critique groups, yeah.
Critique groups. And sometimes you've got someone in that group who's got a really keen eye, and they've been reading forever, and they've read every book ever printed, and they have some insight into it. But I think like you say, Pops, you've got to know which people to listen to. I talk about a choir of voices because of musical themes. that if you hear a choir of voices that are saying that maybe you should do this or that, maybe you listen to that. But if it's just that lone voice crying out in the wilderness, you must write in Courier New. Really? I mean, that's not necessarily true. And it's one reason why, or another reason why, conferences are so valuable. This is, for a lot of people, their only opportunity to meet published authors, editors, agents, people who work in the business and understand the business. And you may not be able to find them on your own time. Your local writers group, I know local writers groups that don't have any published authors, which is, interesting. And they'll bring published authors in, sure, to talk every week or every month or whatever the case is. But if you don't have anyone who's done the work, who understands the process, can be very, very challenging. So, well said, Pop. Well said.
Nor does it mean you have to agree with everything an experienced writer teaches. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got writer friends, and they teach, and there's just some of the things I don't agree with. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean they're not a good writer. I listen to it, I weigh it. Mm-hmm. But if there's somebody who's just not really done the work, and I've seen this in other areas of publishing. Because you don't need a license from the state to be anything in publishing. You don't need one to be an editor. You don't need one to be an agent. You don't need one to be a writer. You don't need any of that. So some people set themselves up as experts that are not. Some set themselves up as experts because they are. Those are the ones you want to listen to.
Yeah. And a good rule of thumb is that if somebody sets themselves up as an expert and asks for money, make sure they're an expert.
Yeah.
Like you say, Pops, the pay to read agent and all that kind of stuff. They're not making their money off signing clients. They're making their money off mm-hmm. the ignorance of new writers and the thrill of the possibility of publication. I
would just say in most cases, there might be somebody who does that, but it's highly unlikely.
There are publishers out there like that. There are record labels that really just try and get people to, buy our services for this, and we're experts in this, and and what they're just doing is they're preying on little garage bands who have dreams of grandeur. And so mm-hmm. you got to be aware. You got to be aware of who you're listening to, do your research. So. Well said, Pops. Well said. So I think that's everything in the notes. So anything else, Pops, or should we wrap it up?
Nope. I think we should wrap it up. Do we have anyone in the room or any questions, anything like that?
I've been following along. We do have some people, but I haven't seen questions. Molly has asked some questions, and some people have answered questions. Let's see. Is this one? When should a writer feel ready and confident enough in themselves to show their work or to begin the query process? Oh, that's a really good question. That comes from Lawrence.
Yeah, Lawrence, is an excellent question, and you'll probably never feel confident enough or ready. You do the best you can, and then you give it a try. That's really all you can do. Once you know what good writing is, you'll be able to tell whether or not you're close to that. You're never going to be able to match it because writers are people and people are different. So, and the one thing that keeps people from becoming writers is the fear of rejection. Look, you're going to get some rejections. Isaac Asimov got rejections. Chris Carter of X-Files got rejections. Stephen King got rejections. Everybody got rejections. All God's children get rejections. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's going to happen. You don't worry about that. Just don't reject yourself.
Right. Yeah, I think this also goes back to if you can get an expert's opinion on it, if you're at a conference or whatnot, mm-hmm. If you can get a professional's eyes on it, editor, agent, writer, and they give you the thumbs up, okay, there you go. Otherwise, if it's polished, if you're not great on grammar, spelling, punctuation, maybe have somebody help you clean it up. If you need to pay for them to clean up 20 pages or something like that, that's fine, but use it as a learning experience. I only say that because I've seen some submissions that were challenging to read, shall we say.
Yeah.
But if you have a good command of the language and you know how to weave a story, at some point, there's not much that you can do other than send it out into the real world. And when you submit for publication, you're going to get rejections, or you're going to get an acceptance. What you're wanting, the best rejections are the personal rejections that say, hey, we read your story. We liked, pages 7 through 9, but the first 6 pages were a little bit slow for us, whatever it is. If they're giving you specific feedback of your work, wow, use it, take that, run with it. That's golden. It's worth more than gold. So, and you're not going to get that until you start submitting for publication. So, hopefully that we cleared it up. I don't know that we did, but those were I think that was the only question that I saw. Are there not, Dave just chimes in here. Are there not certain techniques that some authors use and other authors don't, and both are right? Yeah. I mean,
I would assume so. Not quite sure what's meant by technique. Well, I suppose at a macro sense, there are those who write first person, like Sue Grafton or something, or Sherlock Holmes is written in first person. But there are those who write in first person, those who write in third. Some like to use present tense, which I just can't abide, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. It's just, I can't abide it. So, maybe it's my problem, but so there are some techniques like that. There's some techniques, the approach to writing. Some write as fast as they possibly can without any concerns about whether or not it's good. They just want to get the idea down, then they go back. I know for a while Jack Kavanaugh was writing a screenplay before he would write the novel. And the reason is a screenplay is a pretty good outline. He'd get all the most important dialogue down and stuff like that, and then he'd go back and add another plot line and other such things. So yeah, there's different techniques that people use to write. It's just getting to that level of quality. So
yep. Good. So I think we're good on that. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up. So I always feel like every time I get here, I feel like I'm forgetting something. So I'm sure I'll figure it out after I, end the show.
Sign off. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we do thank you all for listening. If you're looking for us throughout the week, you can find Pops at altongansky.com. You can find Molly Jo, if you miss her, at franklymydearmojo.com. Make sure you stop by, leave her a comment. She misses you guys also. She's in the chat room tonight, though, so it's kind of like she's here. We'll give her half a point for attendance. And then if you're looking for me, I'm at aarongansky.com, where you can find the show notes from tonight's podcast and all our previous podcasts as well. So we thank you so much for listening. And until next time, good writing.